So I'd like to welcome Dr. Jed Fahey from Johns Hopkins University. And Jed is a world-renowned expert on broccoli sprouts, on sulforaphane, and has been focused on helping find ways for people to live their healthiest lives.
That was actually a sort of a no-brainer. It was dictated by environment. So Paul Talley asked me to come and join his group. I had worked on broccoli anthroculture in the 80s at an ag biotech company, and I knew a couple of things about broccoli, not very much. But so I came to Baltimore. His lab, our lab, was in the middle of the city of Baltimore. The lab that I built out was on the 13th floor of an old hospital building, and you had to pass through the patient lobby to get up to it. So the first year I was there, I was growing broccoli, old-fashioned broccoli, what you're used to eating from the grocery store, on fields throughout the eastern shore of Maryland, fairly close by, a few hours away, and bringing these coolers full of broccoli back through the hospital lobby. My technician and I would come through with our muddy boots and our cooler full of stinking broccoli. And we got a lot of stares, some nasty comments from people, patients and physicians alike. But of course, in the middle of the winter, you don't grow broccoli in the eastern shore of Maryland. So we had it grown in various other places, looking for broccoli that had high sulforaphane content. I had a number of incubators, and having been trained as a plant tissue culturist, I started looking at smaller and smaller plants that were grown in the incubator, and realized pretty quickly that the sprouts were actually a much more potent source of glucosinolates, which is the precursor of sulforaphane, than the mature plants or heads of broccoli. It turns out the seeds are even more potent, but nobody had eaten seeds, and at least, as I've said to a number of people, a handful of people in the country eat sprouts. With your new book, the Sprout Book, I hope it becomes not a handful, but maybe 5% or 10% of people eat sprouts. But we searched for numbers to try to find out exactly how many people ate sprouts 20 years ago, and I never ever got a good answer, but it was a very small percent of the eating public, right?
Yes, especially broccoli sprouts. I mean, maybe there was alfalfa or mung bean, but broccoli sprouts weren't on the map yet back then.
They were not. And that's very true. We did put them on the map. I will take credit for that. There are very few things you can say you invented, but I think it's as close as anybody can invent a piece of living matter. We sort of invented broccoli sprouts because they hadn't been sold or grown previously, because no one cared. I mean, there was nothing to attract one to broccoli sprouts. I don't know how alfalfa sprouts got started, but they're no more or less attractive to me, but they were an item of commerce, obviously.
Yeah. So now I'm going to ask you to speak to me. I'm 53, but I want you to speak to me like I'm a 6-year-old. So I understand a glucosinolates. Is that a compound? Is it a molecule? What is glucosinolates?
Mm-hmm. It's just a molecule. So you got a plant. The plant's got cells. What's in the cells? Mostly protein, fat or lipid, right? Or oil, DNA, RNA, what am I missing? Carbohydrates. And the outside of the plant cell is made of cellulose, which is a carbohydrate, a polysaccharide. And however, there are things called phytochemicals. So I just told you all the things that make up the bulk of the plant cell, But these things called phytochemicals are present in very, very low levels, usually very small amounts, but they're very potent or pungent or flavorful or colorful. So chlorophyll is a phytochemical. Most people are familiar with that word, and that's what makes leaves green or sprouts when they turn green. There are carotenoids, which are the kinds of compounds that make leaves, fall leaves red, and they're accessory pigments that are used for helping harvest light and blah, blah, blah. Then there are compounds that are present in lower levels. There are fewer of them in the plants. Things, for example, that make plants smell like whatever they smell like. And so, excuse me, glucoraphanin is one of those compounds that's present in vacuoles in the plant cells, bags of liquid in the plant cells. And it turns out that they're used for defense of the plant when bugs, oh, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, so I'm going to take something in my mouth.
Okay, we want you to be comfortable.
I'm comfortable. I want to be audible.
Okay.
So apologies, but so glucoraphanin is part of the plant's defense armamentarium, if you will, and it's not an active compound in any classical sense of the word. It just sits there and hangs out, and nobody notices it. But when a predator takes a bite out of a plant, that predator can be you as a person, but obviously evolution designed it for bugs or fungi or bacteria. So when a bug takes a bite out of a leaf of a plant, it breaks open the cell that glucoraphanin is in and allows the glucoraphanin to come in contact with an enzyme that breaks up that molecule, changes it around, rearranges it, and it forms something called sulforaphane, which is just some other phytochemical, but sulforaphane happens to be very active biologically, very reactive, and it does a lot of magic things to whoever eats it. Excuse me. Whoever eats it, it's a deterrent to feeding for most bugs, and it turns out that our bodies can repurpose it and use it for their own defense. So that's the short story of it.
So when that's happening, and when we talk about making the sulforaphane more accessible, there's another enzyme that is required to activate that. Could you help me understand that?
Sure. So it's been called the mustard oil bomb in the scientific literature, and it's literally glucoraphanin is sort of this precursor. Some people even view it as a pro-drug, and then the enzyme is called myrosinase, and the enzyme and glucoraphanin come together. Bam, a new molecule emerges. And the idea, as best we can tell, is truly as a plant defense mechanism. So if nobody's chewing on the plant, nobody cares. Glucoraphanin is happy in its little bag of sap. But if someone breaks the plant open, this alert goes out and the defense system is triggered. And so sulforaphane is produced, and it causes bugs, bacteria, whatever to stay away. It's viewed as toxic.
Would that happen in the stomach? Would the digestive fluids be the same kind of aggressive breaking down, or it requires the chewing, grinding, freezing?
Well, it requires chewing or grinding. Digestive juices will eventually break the plant cells, but to sort of go a little farther down the digestive tract, we know that in the intestines, perhaps small, definitely large, there are a ton, well, not a ton, but there are pounds literally of bacteria called the microbiome, right? And those bacteria contain certain species that have myrosinase activity, this enzyme. So the enzymatic breakdown of conversion to sulforaphane does happen in your gut, but below the stomach. The acid of the stomach is so harsh that it really doesn't permit much of anything to live. So when you take unprotected probiotics, for example, they'll typically be destroyed in the stomach. Not many bacteria will survive transit through the stomach, but there's one bacterium which colonizes the stomach, and the way that escapes harm is it tunnels into the mucus layer that lines the inside of the stomach, and then it actually harms the inside of the epithelial cells, the lining of your stomach. Yeah.
Is the sulforaphane is that absorbed in the mouth sublingually when you chew it, or how is it being absorbed?
Yeah, so it's certainly being absorbed in the intestines. We've done a little study. We have a published study I can refer you to with a group at the University of Pittsburgh, in which we looked for absorption directly from the mouth, the oral cavity, and really didn't find much evidence of that. I was sure that we were going to find it being absorbed there, because it does get absorbed very quickly. Whether there's some absorbed in the esophagus, I unfortunately can't tell you. But as soon as it transits through the stomach, we know that it's absorbed in the small intestines and, as I say, the large intestines. And there are a number of studies that show that, other people's as well as ours.
So when you look at sulforaphane itself, and I think there's probably thousands of papers in the scientific literature on sulforaphane. What has been proven? What has not been proven? And what are you comfortable saying about the benefits of sulforaphane?
There are over 3,000 indeed papers dealing with mechanism and some of its modes of action. Look, I mean, this sounds like a politician talking, but in a way I'm trying to be diplomatic and not say things that I would like to retract later, because we do have to be careful not to be overly enthusiastic. There is a lot that has not been proven in Western medicine sanctioned clinical studies. So it has not been proven to be cancer preventive, for example, in those sorts of studies. Yet in all sorts of in vitro studies, test tube studies, animal studies, and many clinical studies, it has been shown to have effect on biomarkers of cancer, or to retard or prevent carcinogenesis, or development of cancer in lab animals. So, but yet as a scientist who's trying not to raise false hope, I can't and shouldn't say that it's cancer preventive, because there really are not good long-term, large numbers of people trials proving that. But the mechanism of action absolutely suggests that it should be cancer preventive. It is what we've called an indirect antioxidant. And I use the term indirect because what that means is the sulforaphane molecule itself is not an antioxidant. It doesn't act like ascorbic acid and get destroyed itself, but it upregulates or boosts or induces a whole slew of protective enzymes, cytoprotective enzymes, antioxidant enzymes, and all of those enzymes actually hang around for certainly hours, in most cases days, doing their antioxidant thing, doing their work. Whereas sulforaphane, you find it in the blood very quickly, it's absorbed, the body sees it, it turns on this protective response, and then sulforaphane is flushed out of the body. So actually the highest concentrations are in the bladder, as they're stored waiting for what's delicately called micturition or urination. So the bladder tissue, I mean, we are dying to see a bladder cancer prevention trial done, and we've tried to catalyze three of them, I think, that never really got off the ground because it's very difficult to do those trials. But one would think that that's an ideal site for the protective action of sulforaphane. So we've shown that it's protective, although not curative, against Helicobacter pylori, the bacteria that I told you gets under the mucus layer of the stomach and causes ulcers and can cause stomach cancer. We have done a lot of studies, and they're ongoing, showing it certainly seems to have effect in autism. Some subset, some percentage of children with autism or autism spectrum disorder have a regression of their symptoms or a reduction of their symptoms when they're on a sulforaphane containing supplement or powder or product. And then their behavior seems to return to what it had been after they go off the sulforaphane. We and others have published on that now, and there are a number of trials ongoing in China and in the US that we've been involved with. So there are all sorts of disease indications, and if anything, you might say, what the hell, everything affected by sulforaphane? Well, it turns out because the molecule targets some very critical protective pathways in the body, there are a large number of very distinct disease states or conditions that seem to be protected against or treatable by sulforaphane to a degree. It's not a cure-all, but certainly it's something that I'd want to have on my side, and I'd want to be using regularly. And by using, I mean pretty much eating broccoli sprouts or cruciferous vegetables, or taking a supplement that contained sulforaphane or the precursor. I choose for whole foods when I have the option, but there are a lot of times when you don't, when you're traveling or something, and you can't get exactly what you want.
What for someone who's healthy, what would be the recommended consumption of sulforaphane or broccoli sprouts? If you could map out what your diet would be like. And I wrote a book on sprouts, and people ask me how many ounces or how many grams of how much broccoli sprouts could I eat? Is there too little or is there too much?
That's a question I love to get asked. And my answer is always a cocky one, but I think it may resonate with you. And the fact is, when you're eating food, it's very, very difficult to eat too much. And why? Because you get grossed out. You can't. You could never eat a diet, or in this world. I mean, if you were on a desert island and it's all you had, I suppose you could eat the same thing again and again and again, day in and day out. But we don't operate like that at all. And you could not eat more than perhaps, I don't know, 4 ounces or so of any kind of sprouts without sort of getting tired of the texture, right? So yes, you could mix them in various different manifestations, but certainly with vegetables that more people are familiar with, you can't think of one, or any food, you can't think of one that someone could eat round the clock and just eat too much of. So 2 to 4 ounces of broccoli sprouts that are rich in glucoraphanin is very reasonable. That amounts to a certain number of micromoles of sulforaphane a day. You asked me to speak to you as if you were a 6-year-old, so
Yes.
I won't talk about micromoles, but it just amounts to the number of molecules of that phytochemical. So where you run into trouble is if you're popping supplements thinking a little bit's good, a lot is better. There you can clearly overdose, just as you would with classic drug.
Have you experimented with the low temperature dehydration of broccoli sprouts?
I have. I can tell you that you have to be very careful dehydrating them or treating them in any way, because what happens is as the plant dries and as the cells shrink and get as they dry, at some point you wind up releasing the enzyme myrosinase and glucosinolates, the precursor, and they come together and they react. And sulforaphane will be present then in those drying broccoli sprouts, but it will react with other stuff in the plant very quickly and become less or not useful to the human being that's eating it. So you're better off either taking sulforaphane that is stabilized in one way or another, or excuse me, ideally eating glucoraphanin and myrosinase together, or just eating glucoraphanin and letting your gut myrosinase work on it. Yeah, you can freeze dry broccoli sprouts, and a number of people that I've talked to have made a very bad mistake doing that. They freeze the sprouts at some point, usually fairly slowly, and as the ice crystals form, they break the plant cells open and release this enzyme, and you have the reaction occurring, which you don't want to happen before you ingest it. And same thing when you're putting them in a freeze dryer and pulling off water vapor. That all has to be done very carefully. So, but I mean, it's doable. But.
So there's been a lot of research on broccoli sprouts and sulforaphane. Do you believe if the amount of dollars or energy was directed towards other sprouts and other varieties, whether they be clover or radish or mung or hemp or alfalfa, that there would be similar magical compounds in them?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we lucked out with broccoli sprouts, honestly. I know that any of the cruciferous vegetables have a similar family of compounds. They're called glucosinolates and isothiocyanates. So you might extend that view to any of the cruciferous sprouts, but you are already familiar with many of them. I think you've made the point in your book, the Sprout book, that which I had the pleasure of reading a copy of a week ago, and it's a great read, and I learned a lot from it. But I can tell you that you make the point that many sprouts have higher contents of nutrients, are more nutritionally packed than their than their parents or the mature vegetables, and that's absolutely true. I mean, seeds, as again, I'm preaching to the choir. You've said this, but seeds are what plants have packaged everything that's needed for the new emerging organism to germinate in a seed. And so for the first, it depends on the species, but the first 7 to 10 to maybe 14 days that most seeds are sprouting, all they're doing is taking all that goodness in the seed, mobilizing some of it, adding water, of course, and as they germinate, and so they're expanding. But they are absolutely, they're all packed with nutrients compared to the parts of the plants that we eat, the mature plants, which of course vary. Some plants you eat leaves, some plants you eat flowers, some plants you eat the fruit or the tubers, and they all have very different ratios of nutrients and of nutritional density. So it's not what you asked, but so yes, I think if a lot more effort was put into exploring the phytochemicals of other sprouts, there would be interesting, very interesting new discoveries. We know a good bit about what phytochemicals are in various sprouts, but more work on exactly where they fit into the biochemical pathways in humans would certainly be beneficial. Yeah.
Have you looked at all into other sprouts, in particular the legumes?
I haven't, except as a consumer. Only because there's only so much you can do. You have to try to stay focused on a narrow slice of the scientific world, and so I haven't. Others have, not so much. I mean, there's been a lot of research on food safety and bacterial contamination in bean sprouts. There, you point out in your book, there have been a few papers, and this was 20 or 30 years ago, I guess, talking about some compounds that came from alfalfa sprouts that maybe weren't desirable. We thought when we started working on broccoli sprouts, we got sort of lucky. It turned out that some phytochemicals that we wouldn't really want to see in abundance in broccoli sprouts were not there compared to market stage broccoli. Those were the indole 3-carbinol and diindolyl methane compounds that have had a sort of checkered or questionable toxicity history about them. And I'm nerding out and going deep in the science, I know, but we saw a profile of phytochemicals that was attractive nutritionally, and we didn't see toxic compounds that we might have been concerned about. When you start looking at new other sorts of sprouts, you never can tell what you'll find, but there'll be some interesting phytochemicals.
So if you were to recommend or suggest to someone to eat broccoli sprouts, what would be the 3 reasons why you'd say you should consider eating this food on a regular basis?
Well, I think because it's protected, because I know in my heart of hearts, and there's a lot of scientific evidence to back that up now, that they are a protective and nutritional food. They are protective against a variety of conditions, even though most of those aren't proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. They're nutritionally robust. There's nothing nasty in them. I think they taste good. Half of the world doesn't agree. People who don't like bitter tastes aren't that fond of them. A lot of people don't like the texture of sprouts that much. Well, I'm sorry, I can't help that. Put them in a smoothie. So you asked for 3 reasons. Okay, so taste, health status or disease protection, and nutrition. And the nutrition case you've made for most sprouts in your book, and I totally agree with you. So that would lead me to not favor one over the other too much. But
and so you've actually grown broccoli sprouts on your own?
Oh my God, yes.
And what's your favorite technique, and what tools do you use?
My favorite technique would be to grow them in a tray with overhead misting, but that's not practical. And most houses I've lived in, it's too much of a pain. I've used the old mason jar with a screen over it approach, or something a little bit bigger, for most home sprouting. The technique that our friends in Japan, who are absolutely stellar, if you haven't visited Japanese broccoli sprouters, you must. Murakami Farms is a company that got started growing broccoli sprouts pretty much right after we discovered them. And we linked up with them as they expressed an interest in growing them. And so they grow them, as to many in the US, in these 5 or 6 foot diameter drums that rotate slowly. They have water periodically misting in, and then the excess water just drips out all over the a drained floor. Murakami, I should just take a small diversion here and say that in Japan, the degree to which people treasure the presentation of food and the quality of food it's amazing, and it does put us to shame here. And in Japan, fresh produce is really valued in a way that people don't value it here, and fresh sprouts are used all over. So Murakami is the premier broccoli sprout grower in the country, and they grow a lot of other sprouts too. But to go and see hundreds, literally hundreds of these 6 foot diameter drums slowly rotating and producing sprouts is very, very cool. There also are people in, it's a long answer to your question, but I'm sort of famous for that. There are people, also friends now in Holland, in the Netherlands, who grow sprouts in the tray setup. They typically grow them a little bigger, to maybe 5 to 7 days, and then they harvest them by cutting the tops off, so that most of their harvest doesn't get the roots. So anyway, those are the 3 sort of methods: the tray, the mason jar, and a rotating drum.
Do you eat the testa and the roots as well, the whole thing?
Yeah. It's too much of a pain to clean it, to make them, free of seed hulls or testa. And there's nothing wrong with them. They're not toxic or bad for you. Maybe you have to pick your teeth later, so what?
Right. So,
Yeah.
so you feel that a couple of ounces a day of broccoli sprouts are good for the diet, good for the health. And in terms of, are there other kind of antidepressive qualities of sulforaphane, or energy, or anything else you've stumbled upon but haven't proven?
I sort of wish you hadn't asked that question, because the answer is yes, yes, and yes, but yes, we haven't proven it. So there is a lot of interest in sulforaphane for its effects on neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative conditions, as I mentioned, including autism. And some of the signs and signals we get with autism suggest that it may have to do, and this is, this will be published soon, but some of it is published. There's a suggestion, for example, that the mitochondria, the energy powerhouses of the cells, are involved in the genesis of, for example, autism. And we know from work of my colleague Albena Dinkova-Kostova in Dundee, Scotland, that sulforaphane is very active in affecting mitochondrial energetics. So you make that connection with mitochondria and energy. You asked about energy. Clearly, we know there are connections there. Connection with neurodevelopmental conditions like autism. I have a colleague at Hopkins that is doing a clinical study with using sulforaphane in schizophrenia. And then there's another trial in China in which, again, sulforaphane, plain and simple, is being used. They're actually using a supplement, because it's much easier to do clinical trials with a supplement. You get a dose, the same dose every time, and you don't have to worry about whether people like broccoli sprouts. But they're using something called Avmacol, which is a combination of active myrosinase and glucoraphanin. And so one of the schizophrenia trials is in China. There's another autism trial in China, and again, a schizophrenia trial in the US, and about 5 in total follow-up autism trials. we published with Andy Zimmerman at Harvard in 2014 on our work with sulforaphane, his work, I should say, with sulforaphane and autism. So there are all these connections, and yes, so you said energy, depression. I mean, depression, I would say, is a little farther down the road experimentally. So I'm not aware of trials specifically targeting depression. And what was the third thing you asked about? Condition.
That was a spontaneous question, not from my notes. So
well, that's okay, but I'm trying to remember what it was. So because the answer to that was I think yes too, but anyway.
Well, we'll jump on to the next question.
Yeah.
How is it for the immune function, the immune system?
Well, again, so that you didn't ask that, but that's also one that I have to answer the same way. So immune function, although there's a tighter connection here, immune function is heavily tied up with inflammation of the central nervous system, inflammation in the gut-brain axis. And one of the things sulforaphane does very clearly, we see this with biomarkers in people, we see it in animal studies, is it damps down the inflammatory response. It reduces inflammation. So, is there a direct connection with immune function? I think I'd have to say yes in this case. Most of it's based on biomarker work in human trials and human clinical studies. When I refer to things this way, all of this stuff is published, and we've either reviewed it or I can point you to the papers that to cite chapter and verse. And you're familiar with some of them because your book is so well referenced. I know you're familiar with some of them. So
yeah, I think that the thing is, me being a lay person, my book is less from a biblical perspective, but it's more over like a conversation starter that I wanted to be able to help people understand, the beginning and the potential of this. And, the book is opening the door so that you and I can have a conversation and we can share this information because, as you were describing before, your preference would be to get nutrition from the consumption of food rather than from supplements. So now that's what I'm really looking for, is to see, especially now, sprouting is such an important part of the normal. I'm just shifting here. Sprouting provides such incredible potential for people to have food sovereignty and food autonomy. And so from one area, like I'm sure what you were articulating before is the consumption of the seeds is very powerful, for the sulforaphane itself. And if we look at, what happens in the 1 week of growing from the seed into a sprout, you're getting, like 1 cup of broccoli sprouts has 60% of the daily allowance of vitamin C. Mm-hmm. So given your choice, would you rather get your 60% of RDA of vitamin C from broccoli sprouts or from ascorbic acid, or does it not matter?
So, I mean, that's a question that it's interesting. I always used to answer that question the following way, but let me tell you why I've changed my tune recently. I was just to say, of course, it's better to get your nutrition from the plant or the fresh food, fresh fruit or vegetable, ideally, and period. End of story. Who wants supplements? You don't need them. The reason I've changed my tune is, as I've gotten older, I suppose I've gotten wiser, and I have a lot of friends who are in the supplement business because, you know, we've talked to people who are making these things as supplements. But more than that, you know, I got my doctorate in human nutrition at the School of Public Health at Hopkins, and over the years I've been confronted with a number of things. First of all, the international world. I mean, a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world just don't have the food choices we have, and there are cases where, for example, vitamin C supplementation, vitamin A, vitamin D, on, are absolutely prudent. So that sort of softened me to the supplement concept. Further, and perhaps more, well, certainly more appropriate to you and I, or to the world we're living in, is the fact that there are a lot of people in this country who, for reasons, you know, you can, all sorts of reasons, are of a health status where they don't move very much. Part of that's work environment. People sit on their butts for 8 hours a day unless they're lucky like you and live out in the desert. Or they're lucky like me and get out and ride a bike and walk as often as they can. So there are a lot of people who just don't move very much and don't have very good diets. And what are you going to do about it?
Right.
And I this is a real challenge. What are you going to do about it? You're not going to twist their arm and make them eat better. So maybe the responsible thing is to suggest that they at least supplement with things you know are good for them. But the third reason, and this is where age has given me some perspective, is as we get older, I mean, I'm almost 66. I'm 65 and 65.934 years old. So, something like that.
Yeah.
I need to figure that out. But we don't move as much. We just don't. We're not as physically active. So extrapolate that another 20 years, let's say. And when you get to a point where you're just not moving as much, many people get there. Hopefully I'll never will, but I probably will. Then you just don't eat as much, and you can't consume the 9 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, and on and on and on. So, and you also need more of certain vitamins, for example. So as I say, I've softened to the idea of supplements, and I do take some, and I do think that at some point we sort of have to bend our thinking a little bit and not be so dogmatic and say, you've got to eat fresh fruits and vegetables and the hell with supplements. So anyway.
Have you done any research or have you experimented with broccoli sprout juice?
I have experimented with it personally, and I don't find it terribly delicious.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
Pungent. It's very pungent.
it is, and it's still, yeah. I mean, you pretty much want to mix it with something, right? So it's interesting though that for some of our clinical trials in China that we did back in the early 2000s, my colleague Tom Kensler and many others, but he set up this site, and we used a freeze-dried broccoli sprout extract that my lab and I had made in Baltimore and out in the freeze drying operation in Oregon, actually. But to deliver that powder to the subjects, these were, I think, 300 subjects, I believe, in this trial. We either had to put them in pills, put this powder in pills, or deliver it in a juice or a food that they were going to be eating. So we got, as I recall, it was 7 PhDs sitting around a table in a lab in a conference room in Baltimore, sampling all these juices and custards and things to try to camouflage the taste of broccoli sprout juice. And we came up with a solution that all 7 of us voted for. We knew it was a winner, and it was mango juice. And indeed, it did camouflage the taste pretty well and smell. But then we brought it to China. As you can imagine, there was quite some expense and falderall involved in doing that. Nobody really liked it. Why? Because we hadn't anticipated, oh yeah, they don't like the cultural mores are that it was too sweet.
Mm.
Americans, so there were actually was a breast cancer elective mammoplasty study that some colleagues were doing in the States in Baltimore, and Americans loved the taste of mango juice with broccoli sprouts, but the Chinese didn't. So I had to go back to the drawing board and get a sensory analyst, friend of mine from New Jersey, Gail Seville, who's a world expert at this, and she helped us do a study to identify the best way to camouflage the taste of broccoli sprouts for our next trip to China. And it wound up being half strength. This is no secret. It's published and happy to share it, but half strength pineapple juice with a few drops, like about 1 or 2% of lime juice. So pineapple and lime offset the taste of broccoli, and the Chinese loved it, and Americans love it. So now we ought to go into business and make a drink.
Yeah. Well, and that was using the freeze-dried powder that
Yeah.
was reconstituted with
Right.
juice.
Over there. Yeah. So we shipped it all over, and then we put together the lime juice, the pineapple juice, diluted it 1-to-1 with water, and added the broccoli sprout powder.
And if you were to, and I'm sure you've seen in your 65.93 years, wheatgrass juice.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
with wheatgrass juice, it's not a very appealing flavor. It's probably sweeter than the broccoli and less bitter and pungent. But it's only, if you were to, I would dare say, if you took 8 ounces of broccoli sprouts and put them into a wheatgrass juicer or something else, maybe you'd get 1 ounce of juice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. And I have to tell you, I loved your description in your book about, I'm pointing to your book. I'm looking at it because I brought it here with me.
Yeah,
but
thank you.
Yes, shout out for this book, which is great. In your book, you talk about the fact that wheatgrass has to be juiced because there's so much cellulose and we can't digest the cellulose. I had never thought of that. I often wondered, because I'm not a fan of wheatgrass, but I often wondered why people always juiced it. And now I know. It's because it's so high in cellulose.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is the bioavailability of the insoluble fiber of the broccoli sprouts actually gets broken down and digested easier, my understanding, than mature broccoli from that perspective. Are you missing anything from doing the broccoli sprout juice other than the insoluble fiber? Would you be getting the sulforaphane and the glucosinolates, and would the juicing activate the myrosinase?
So I'm sorry, I'm eating these Ricolas and I sound like I got my mouth full of marbles, but it's either that or lose my voice. Short answer, yes, you are activating myrosinase, and therefore that's not so good because you better drink it right away.
Right away.
Not let it sit around. Yeah. But in my mind, one of the advantages of eating the fresh whatever it is instead of a freeze-dried powder in a gel cap or a supplement is you get all the fiber from that plant. And so I favor eating the fiber. I favor getting, I like the idea that you're getting the fiber. You need fiber rather than juicing it. So, but I mean, it's more a matter of personal taste. I mean, I think if you can get someone to eat broccoli sprouts, either by juicing them or by eating them, they're going to be better off than not eating them.
So in terms of the evolution, of the research on broccoli sprouts and sulforaphane, you are winding down this chapter of your life. Do you feel your work is complete with broccoli sprouts and sulforaphane, or how much more research is there to do on it?
So no, I don't. I don't feel that it's complete. I think, and I view it, by the way, as not winding down, but just turning to a new chapter. Um, but because, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, I want to spend more time translating our very technical stuff, hopefully to something that's a little bit more palatable to the lay public, more understandable than hardcore science. But um, you had sent me a couple of questions ahead of time, and I think one of the questions you asked me was, what challenges haven't you been able to solve? Which is,
Yeah.
and my answer would be, how much time do you have? So I'd sort of answer your question about more work on broccoli sprouts the same way, I suppose. But I think, we've got the phytochemistry down pat. We've got the bioavailability pretty well covered. I think really well-focused, well-executed clinical studies, which cost a lot of money, unfortunately, aimed at specific indications and done well is just really important. There are many clinical studies are very expensive, and there are many studies that just aren't done that carefully or thought out carefully enough ahead of time. And I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but it's just, it happens, and you really lose a lot of opportunities when you don't milk a study for everything you can get out of it, every drop of information you can get out of it. So I think more clinical studies need to be done.
And there's something that I was reading about mixing mustard seeds or mustard sprouts with broccoli sprouts. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. So there are, I don't know, 600 or so different types of cruciferous vegetables. I mean, I may have that wrong by a few hundred. There are hundreds and hundreds of cruciferous vegetable species and subspecies and types. Broccoli is just one of them. All of the crucifers have myrosinase and a glucosinolate, what I called earlier the mustard oil bomb. And when you chew on any of them and mix them up, the enzyme myrosinase reacts with glucoraphanin and makes, or with the glucosinolate, and makes an isothiocyanate, and it's good for you, or it's an antioxidant, or trust me, it'll help you. And in this political world, you know what we think anytime someone says trust me, immediately run the other way. But I'm telling you that isothiocyanates by and large appear to be good for you for various reasons. So when one looks at the amount of that enzyme myrosinase in broccoli, it turns out that broccoli is not the champ in terms of its activity of that enzyme. It's not nearly as active as the enzyme in mustard seed. And again, with hundreds of species of crucifer, we haven't looked at them all, and other people haven't either. But mustard seed and daikon, Japanese radish, either the root itself or the seed of Japanese radish, are very, very potent sources of the enzyme. They don't have the sulforaphane precursor, interestingly, neither of them do. They have some other glucosinolate. But so as a result, we and others have used mustard seed as a source of myrosinase for a number of test tube for a number of studies, and I see that. So if I had to recommend a source of myrosinase, you have to weigh the fact that you don't want to have to go to the cliffs of Dover or some Mediterranean outpost where wild brassicas are growing on a cliff. You want to get something that's readily available. And so mustard seed and daikon, actually, seed or the root, are widely available and therefore a good choice if you want to mix them. But you don't have to. Sorry, I know you're going to ask another question, but the problem is that most people don't like the taste of broccoli seeds, and they're bitter, And so grinding up broccoli seed as a source of both glucoraphanin and myrosinase just isn't so cool, because nobody really much wants to eat it, unless you roast the broccoli seeds, and you have to be very careful doing that because you can burn them easily. But when you roast them, you knock out the enzyme, so it doesn't work.
Yeah. What is the ideal date or duration of time in sprouting that you would recommend consuming the broccoli sprouts?
From the time you get them make them, you mean?
Yeah, like I mean, I was reading, some people recommend on the third day or on the fifth day, and
when you harvest them.
when you harvest them, yes.
Yeah. We have typically stuck to 3 days, with the idea that a vigorously germinating broccoli sprout looks good, looks like alfalfa sprouts looked before man and woman knew about broccoli sprouts.
Right.
I mean, it's a good size, we also know that the farther away you get from the seed on a per gram basis, the more you're diluting out the phytochemical, the glucoraphanin, until you get to 14 days or maybe beyond, and you start putting true leaves on the plant instead of the cotyledons expanding. Then you start synthesizing the glucosinolates again. But for that first week and a half, something like that, you're just diluting out what's already in the seed and mobilizing compounds and doing a lot of metabolism, but not really making. Yeah.
So there's a finite amount of the glucoraphanin in every seed, and as it grows, it doesn't increase. It just, its proportional ratio to the entire sprout decreases as the sprout is gaining more fiber and more mass.
Yes, exactly. And I wish everybody, one of the things we tried to develop or to invent is a little, like a pregnancy test kit or pH dipstick, so you could test the amount of glucoraphanin in your sprouts or extract or supplement. We never did manage to do that, but I mean, the obvious question is, well, if you're going to grow sprouts yourself or buy them, how do you know how much glucoraphanin is in there? And it can vary hugely. And so you have to trust your vendor as it stands now, whether it's a vendor of seeds or sprouts, if they're making claims about it. Most of them choose not to, because it's very difficult to back those claims up.
Does sulforaphane exit the body through urine or through feces, or does it, like, what happens to it? Does it just evaporate?
It gets conjugated. It gets taken up by cells very quickly, within minutes to hours, and within minutes to hours, no more than a few hours, it's goes into the urine, winds up in the bladder as a conjugate. Most of it is not free sulforaphane anymore, but it's conjugated to something called glutathione, which is the body's most predominant antioxidant. And so it's conjugated and it's excreted, because the body doesn't want to see it hanging around very long, interestingly. So in mobilizing the excretion mechanism, it mobilizes this detoxification pathway, which is what we're exploiting.
Well, Jed, thank you so much. I'm sure there's going to be some younger versions of yourself that will be listening to this and seeing this, and your wisdom is, I'm sure will help them. It certainly helped me. I'm going to have to look up what humility means, but I think that this very powerful, message, and I think your career has been extraordinary. And in some respects, I think it's just beginning, as you're beginning a new chapter.
Well, A, you're too kind, and B, thank you, and I hope you're right. So, thank you. It's been a great pleasure, and I really enjoyed talking with you. I hope to talk to you more in the future.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jed.
Okay, eat your sprouts. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.